Okay, we are going to start the blood section now. The blood section will be the first part of the cardiovascular, so it'll be section 3, part 1, and the other part will be the cardiovascular system itself, which will deal with blood pressure, blood flow, and a few other things. So we will move through this one. Blood's very important, especially for people going into clinical medicine, and probably one of the more important components of this class. Okay, so there are three main components of what we often call the cardiovascular system. Cardiovascular is a anatomical name, to be honest, but it's not a bad name. It's also known functionally as the circulatory system because blood circulates through your body. In terms of the cardiovascular system, there's three main components, and that I think you can see right here. It's made up in terms of the word for the most part. So cardio refers to cardia, that's heart. Vascular refers to vessels, and what's in the heart and vessels are the blood. So the three major components of the cardiovascular system, two of which are in the name: hearts, vessels, and the blood. Okay, so now we'll look at the functions of the circulatory system. The major functions, number one, would be transport, right? So there's our transport function right there. For transport, the major things we transport in the blood are gases. So here's our gas right here. Nitrogen, it really should say N2, although I think I have it on the straight line, not the freehand. So N2. We also have oxygen and carbon dioxide, among other gases in the blood. There are also nutrients in the blood. Nutrients would be things like amino acids, glucose, lipids, things the body needs. There are signaling molecules such as hormones in the blood. Not even listed here would be other components like ions and things like that. So ions, not that it's easy to write, but ions would be important for sodium, potassium, calcium chloride. Waste products like urea, ammonia, other things like that. Hydrogen ion potentially, so H plus also go in the ions. And we transport water. Water is important for cells, and we do that. The second major essential function is protection. Protection comes in a couple different ways. One, obviously, is immunity. And, it's a big thing right now that we're looking at in terms of the immune system and how coronavirus attacks us and some of the things it does and how to make us less susceptible to having severe complications because of it. And part of that is the immune system. And so not all of our immune system is in the blood, but certainly the white blood cells and various proteins that are dissolved in blood are important in terms of immunity. The other big thing for the blood is the clotting, and blood clots to prevent the loss of itself. So that's an important protective mechanism as well. There are clotting factors in the blood that help the blood to clot, but obviously the most important portion of the blood that's important for clotting would be the platelets, or also known scientifically as the thrombocytes. So that's important. And then the last one that's important for blood is temperature regulation. Blood flow helps to determine temperature regulation. So if you look at this figure right here, for this person, if you take a look at their face and how red it is, that shows an increase in blood flow And it looks like, it's hard to tell, it looks like a fairly warm environment, I would guess. And so this person who just finished running is dissipating heat by sending more blood to the face, and that helps to maintain core body temperature. So that's an important function as well. So those are the major functions of blood. Okay, so we'll also look at the characteristics of blood. Blood is highly viscous fluid. That old saying, blood is thicker than water, is certainly true. That being said, blood is more than half water. The portion of blood that is water we call the plasma. One of the things we might as well just mention now, there's another component that's similar to plasma, and we've talked about it before. Again, trying to write with the mouse. That's serum. And serum is like plasma, but the clotting factors have been removed. You can inactivate them by a chemical. We've done that in the lab with heparin, when we've used those heparinized capillary tubes. You can do it with sodium citrate. There's a few other things that you can do that. Or you can let the blood clot, remove the clot and the factors itself, and then you're left with serum. So that makes up typically, 50-60% of the blood is water. The blood also has a fairly high salt content. It's 0.9%, so it's a little less than 1%. That would include all of our salts, not just sodium chloride, but other things. Blood tends to have a pH right around 7.4. The range is 7.35 to 7.45. When blood gets below 7.35, it's a condition called acidosis, excessive hydrogen ion in the blood. When blood gets above 7.45, it's called alkalosis, right? And that's when the blood pH is excessively high. It's too basic. The venous end, right, which should be spelled O-U-S, tends to be towards the lower end of the pH range because it carries more CO2, which then, remember from lab 2, CO2 acts as an acid in the blood, so it drops the pH. So some of the general characteristics: it's thick, it's sticky, it's about more than half water, it's salty, and it's got a pH right around 7.4. It's a little higher than neutral. The other portions of the blood are the solid portion, or what we call the formed elements. So the formed elements are important for a number of reasons, and there are three basic formed elements. The red blood cells, their main function is to carry oxygen, also known as erythrocytes. Erythro means red. The white blood cells, their job is protection and immunity. That we mentioned is one of the major functions of blood previously today. The white blood cells, there's subtypes, and we'll look at those in lab, as well as talk about them towards the end of the blood lecture. There's 5 subtypes we're going to have to worry about, and of those subtypes, there are subtypes as well. And so white blood cells are important for immunity, and then there are platelets. By the way, white blood cells are called leukocytes. Leuko means white, cyte means cell. And the platelets are the clotting cells, and they're thrombocytes. Literally, thrombo means clot, cyte means cell, so they're literally called clotting cells. So the blood is made up of what we often call whole blood, the liquid and the solid. The liquid is called plasma, which makes up about 60% of the blood, and the solid portion is called the formed elements, which makes up about 40% of the blood, and that's made up of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. A couple other things that we can look at. Blood, as we said before, is highly viscous. That means it's got it's kind of thick. It's also sticky. One of the problems with smoking is smoking thickens your blood, and it makes it more difficult, not only on the respiratory system, but also on the cardiovascular system, and that's why smoking is associated with higher risk of heart disease and things like that. So, the viscosity of blood being thicker and stickier is good because that helps us to avoid blood loss if we have injury or cuts or things like that. But it's bad if blood becomes too difficult to circulate. Okay? And so the word that we're really looking at for the thickness is viscosity. And, one of the problems with smoking is it increases the viscosity of the blood. And we'll see later in the cardiovascular section that as we increase the viscosity of blood, that increases the blood pressure, and that often leads to hypertension, things like that. So blood constitutes the majority of your total body weight. The average person in terms of total body water has about 60% of your body is water, right? So, H2O, right, the chemical form of water, that makes up well over 60% of your body. Infants, interestingly, have a very high water content. That's because water is such a good heat sink, and it allows body temperature to be much more stabilized. You need a high input of energy or output of energy to change temperature water very much. So that helps regulate an infant's temperature. And elderly also have a lower amount of water within their body. And interestingly, then that makes the two extreme ends, infants and elderly, much more susceptible to dehydration and water loss because infants need all the water to regulate temperature, and elderly don't have much water to lose in terms of excessive water. So total body water makes up about 60% of your body weight. In that formula we've talked about before, there's like the magical, mythical male model, right, that we look for medical stuff. And usually we say they weigh about 72 kilograms or sometimes even 70. That's about 154 pounds. If you take 60% of that, you get to 42 kgs. And the great thing about the metric system is 1 kg of water is 1 liter of water, so 42 kgs is 42 liters. So our total body water, or what we refer to as TBW, right, is 42 liters of water. Okay, we'll go through this pretty quickly because we've seen this before. We can divide the 42 liters, so I'll just put it up here. That's our total body water, right? We can divide that up into two basic components. The ICF, or intracellular fluid, that's what we see on the inside of cells. That makes up about 28 liters, which is about 2/3 of 42. The extracellular fluid, or the ECF, is fluid outside the cells. The ECF is made up of about 1/3 of your total body water, about 14 liters. So together 14 and 28 equals your total 42 liters. We can further subdivide the ECF, the extracellular fluid, into these different components. The interstitial fluid, that's the fluid that bathes the cells, about 10 to 11 liters. The plasma, that's why we're talking about this now, that's the liquid portion of blood, it's about 3 liters. And the transcellular fluid is less than 1 liter, so it's 0 to 1 liter. And that's fluid that doesn't fit any of the other categories. It's not inside a cell, it's not bathed in a cell, it's not in your blood itself as plasma. So it's called transcellular fluid. And a good example of that would be like intraocular fluid. So the vitreous and aqueous humors in the eye would be like that. Here's a good number to know. And actually this has been, I know, on the TEAS test before, because one of the students told me. The total blood volume. The total blood volume for a human is often considered to be about 5 or 5.5 liters. Again, it's not really a great number, and it really depends on body size. And we'll kind of see a little bit different way to look at it. But total blood volume is considered to be your plasma plus your formed elements. So the liquids plus the solids add together your total blood volume. That's about 5.5 liters for an average human. A better way to look at blood volume is, because it's dependent upon weight, is not to look at it and say, okay, it's 5 to 5.5 liters. And that's true for that medical, mythical male model we talked about. But the best estimate of body weight is about blood volume is 8% of body weight in kgs. So somebody who weighs 70 kgs, right, that's our mythical male, 8% of that, right? So it'd be times 0.08, and that would come out to, 0.56. So it's about 5.5 liters of blood, and we saw that was the normal values that we had before. To kind of give you an idea of what we're looking at, here are some of the Star Wars figures where you have Jabba the Hutt, who weighs 1,000 kilograms. So times 0.8, he would have 8 liters of blood. Silicious Crumb, right? That's this little guy right here. He weighs about 20 kgs, so 20 times 0.08 is 1.6 liters. And then, we have our other figure here who weighs about 60 kgs, which would be about 4.8 liters. So it's probably a better estimate. It works for most animals, to be honest, especially mammals. It doesn't work for birds very well because of their bone structure, but works pretty well for most animals. So that's how we figure out blood volume, which is a much better estimate of using 8% of body weight than actually assuming 5 or 5.5 liters. Another way to look at whole blood is after centrifugation. Centrifugation separates blood into its various components. What you do is you take a tube or vial of blood, you put it in a centrifuge, which spins very, very quickly, and it separates the blood actually into a couple different components. Let's start at the top. The top part tends to be a yellowish or sometimes clear liquid. That's our plasma. And so that's everything we talked about in plasma. So it's got the water, 90-something% water. It's got the dissolved particles we talked about, the ions, the energy, the gases, and all the other things. The other most apparent portion is what is called the packed red cell volume, or also known as the hematocrit. All right, so the hematocrit, we can see it down here, written, hematocrit. Anytime you see the word hemo or hemato, from a scientific point of view, it often refers to the blood. So the hematocrit is what's called the packed red cell volume, and because of the weight and density of the red cells, they pack down at the very bottom of the tube when you centrifuge it. And the hematocrit's a very important reading for a number of reasons. So that makes up our red cells. And notice the red cells make up the vast majority of the cellular component. And then what's left is this little section right here. That's called the Buffy code. It's typically less than 1% of the total, so you can just see it's small right there. And you can look close enough, you can see platelets and different types of white cells. The Buffy code is small for a number of reasons. The white blood cells, as we'll kind of see over here when we look at the kind of easy details about them. For every 500 to 1,000 red cells, you have one white cell. And so since we have so few white cells relative to red cells, they don't make up a very big volume. The other portion of it is platelets. Now, platelets, we have a couple 100,000 platelets in a microliter of blood. So they're not, non-existent or anything, but they're just cell fragments. So together they just make up a small part, and that's a Buffy code. It's actually very hard to see with the naked eye oftentimes as well when you do that. So we just ignore the Buffy code for calculation purposes, and we just say, okay, if the hematocrit, which is the packed red cell volume, is 42%, then we just take the difference from 100% and say, oh, the plasma is 58%, and so on. So we just do that. So if the hematocrit was 30%, right? So if this was 30%, then the plasma would be considered 70%. And hematocrit is something we'll measure in lab and look at the number for lab, and it's used to assess anemia. Just as an aside, the anemia is considered when you have a hematocrit below 37. Now, even though we talked about in terms of percentage, nobody ever usually reports in percentage. We just say 30. So it's really seems like a unitless value, but it's in percentages. So when we look at the whole blood here, there are a couple things we want to look at. Again, this top part right here is the liquid portion, that's plasma, and we'll talk more detail about plasma in a minute. The hematocrit down here, right, from here to here is hematocrit. We see all the red cells. Again, the red blood cells scientifically are called erythrocytes. That literally means red cell. From a number standpoint, they make up about 95% of the formed elements. They are approximately 5 million per microliter of blood. So this little symbol that looks like it's called a mu symbol, right? That's microliter of blood. And their main function is to carry oxygen. And 97% or so of your oxygen is carried on a red blood cell. Talk about red blood cells in detail as well. The white blood cells, which we call WBCs, scientifically are known as leukocytes. Leuko means white. Their number is about 5,000 to 10,000 per microliter of blood. So there's many fewer white cells than there are red cells. And their main function, as we mentioned before, is immunity. They help us keep us free from disease. Also in that buffy coat where the white cells are, that middle coat right here, right, are the thrombocytes. Again, thrombo means clotting cells. In everyday life, we call them the platelets. And there's a couple 100,000 per microliter of blood there. So about 200 to 400,000 there. And literally, thrombo means clot. So their function is to help with blood clotting. Okay, so let's kind of break down what plasma is and what's in plasma. Again, plasma is composed primarily of water. Depending on what book or source you read, it's usually given about 94%. So most of our plasma is water. Since plasma makes up more than half of your blood, then water is basically about 50% of your whole blood. Okay? What's not water is mostly protein. Okay, so protein makes up a fairly significant amount of your plasma portion, and really of the part that's not water, it makes up basically 80% of that, which means that what's left is only 2%. What's left are your ions, gases, nutrients, and other things that we find in blood. We will talk more about proteins in a second, but again, I just want to emphasize that plasma versus serum component. Serum, right, remember, is the plasma with the clotting factors removed, so minus the clotting factors. And again, you can inactivate them, or you could use some other method to have them clot and remove them, or anything that inactivates or removes the clotting factors would cause plasma to become serum. Okay, so again, whole blood, mostly water, over 90%, 2% or so are gases, ions, sodium, potassium, chloride, nutrients, carriers, hormones, other types of proteins, immune proteins, things like that, all come in the protein category at 8%. Okay, so if it's not a protein, it's in the everything else column, and we'll take a look at these different proteins right here, which make up the majority of what's left. Okay, so your first protein, and a very important protein, are the albumins. Most people call them albumin, but it's actually a number of different, very similar functioning, very similar looking proteins. And they are critical for a number of standpoints. They make up most 60% or so of your plasma proteins. So when we look at what's the most things in plasma, water by far number one, albumins by far number two. And they're critical for a number of reasons, but one is they're very important in terms of the osmotic regulation of blood as well as the viscosity of blood. So we said that viscosity increases the thickness, right? So viscosity sort of measures thickness. So the albumins help to play a role. There's other things that increase viscosity of blood. The relative amount of water, the red blood cell number, as an example, can, if we have less water or more red blood cells, that'll also increase the viscosity. But the major osmotic regulator of blood is the albumins as well. So albumins increase viscosity, and they help to maintain what we call the colloid osmotic pressure. And basically, when blood goes through a capillary, so if this was a capillary, okay, so here's my capillary where blood's going through, and what would happen is at the beginning of the capillary, water would be forced out, okay? Now, as water is forced out of this capillary, we have to bring water back in, and what's going to help bring water back in are our little proteins, okay? So our little albumins. And what happens is albumins are dissolved in blood. They're protein. They're dissolved in the plasma. And what they do is they have an osmotic gradient. So anything dissolved would have an osmotic pressure. What they do is they tend to pull not all, but a little bit of the water back into the capillary. So there's always in a capillary normally a net loss of water. So we don't have as much water that we start with here than we end up here. But there is some loss, but a portion of the water is returned. If that water is not returned because we don't have enough of these blood proteins, then it starts to accumulate in the interstitial fluid out here, and that causes edema, swelling, things like that. This person does not have this condition here probably, but just looking at this leg, right, you can see the edema and swelling that's there from that. So, why do we show the eggs? Well, we call eggs egg white even though they're clear. And what makes that egg white stuff right here, that's the albumin, right? And so actually denaturing the protein here, and that's what makes egg white white. The next important blood protein, or what we collectively call the gammaglobulins, while they're not the most numerous, they're the most distinctly different ones. They are essential for the immune response. There's a number of different gammaglobulins. They are subclasses of serum proteins, and they're very important in terms of antibodies. And so they include what we call the immunoglobulins. So the immunoglobulins, IgE, IgA, things like that help us keep us free from disease. They provide protection against foreign invaders, and you have a specific AB antibody, that's what this stands for, antibody, for each pathogen. So any pathogen that we would run into, we would have an antibody for it. And that's one of the reasons potentially why the coronavirus is so serious, is that since it's a if you read the science reports, and especially stuff that came out earlier, they called it the novel coronavirus. And that's because we haven't seen that strain of the coronavirus. There are 6 other coronaviruses that make humans sick. 2 were SARS and MERS, and they don't exist anymore as far as we know in nature, although there are in laboratories. And then there are 4 ones that just cause the common cold. And none of those are specific enough to have our body provide antibodies against the novel coronavirus we see, or what we call COVID or COVID-19 that they refer to. So the idea of getting an immunization for that would be figure out how to get the body to produce antibodies against that virus. So if it does get into your body's going to be able to attack it and kill it before it has a chance to make you sick. And so every antibody that we have is, specific for a very small class of things that only fit in this particular thing. So guess what? They're proteins that have protein receptors, and so they have specificity. So, we have a lot of these very, very different antibodies in our blood. Next on our list of important blood proteins is fibrinogen. Now, when we see the root word, the ogen, typically in science, can't really mark this, that means it's inactive. Not that looks awful, but it says inactive right there. And you might have seen this like pepsinogen, right? Pepsinogen is what we call a zymogen. It's an inactive enzyme until it gets activated. And fibrinogen is the same thing. Fibrinogen is soluble in the blood. Okay, and that's the key. It's soluble in the blood. And it's a precursor to what we call fibrin. Now, fibrin is a net-like structure. So these little pink things right here, this is the fibrin that forms a net, and the platelets and the red blood cells get stuck in the net, and that causes a blood clot. So we don't want blood clotting in a vessel, right? If we had blood clot in an unbroken blood vessel, it's called a thrombus, sometimes known, right? So a thrombus. So a thrombus is a clot in an unbroken blood vessel. That's a pathological condition. You could also have an embolus, which moves. That's the difference. But a thrombus is a clot in an unbroken blood vessel. So we don't want the soluble things in the blood vessels. We only want to have those. We want the soluble things in blood. We don't want the insoluble things, right, in blood. Otherwise, it would stop blood flow. We only want to form those when there's a need for a clot, when we've had a cut or a rupture. And so the fibrinogen turns into fibrin, which forms the net and actually captures the red blood cells to form a blood clot. Okay, so that's important for us. And lastly, for us, in terms of proteins, we're going to look at carrier proteins. These are also in the blood. Any molecule that we have that would be considered to be hydrophobic, right? That would be a polar non-polar molecule. So this would be non-polar. And non-polar molecules do not dissolve in water. So if we have these non-polar molecules that don't dissolve in water, right, they would solubilize and they would cause problems with blood flow. So the idea is that the hydrophobic molecules, right, these lipid-soluble non-polar molecules, have carriers that allow them to be soluble in the blood. Right? So as an example, we've talked about HDL and LDL. I'm sure you understand these are forms of cholesterol. And the HDL stands for high density. The L is lipoprotein. So lipoprotein tells us it's not only a lipid, right, but it's got a carrier that allows it to be soluble in the blood. And so any of the steroids or steroid hormones, for example, or fats are going to need a carrier in the blood. So cholesterol, any steroids like testosterone or estrogen, aldosterone, and even free fatty acids all need a protein carrier in the blood to make it soluble. The other thing that the carrier proteins do is they regulate the availability of certain molecules. So as an example, transferrin, which is a protein, so transferrin is a protein that helps to control the level of iron. Remember, iron was Fe. That was important for making a red blood cell, as an example. So in summary, for the characteristics of blood, right, it's salty, tends to have a neutral pH around 7.4, it's very viscous, makes up about 8% of your total body weight. Its major functions are transport, protection, and temperature regulation. The contents are about 60% plasma. Most of that is water, so 90% or more is water. Of what's left, 80% of that, or 8% of the total plasma, are proteins. There are 4 important proteins: albumins, gammaglobulins, fibrinogen, and carriers. The rest of plasma is made up of ions, gases, nutrients, wastes, and things like that. The solid portion is called the formed elements. That makes up about 40 to 50%. Those are made up of your cellular elements, the red blood cells, white blood cells, and since they're cell fragments, we can't call them cells, platelets. So that's a nice summary of our red, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. We'll spend more time talking in detail about a few of the other elements.